Most know that Joan of Arc burned at the stake for heresy, but few know the very last thing she saw as the flames engulfed her. Joan of Arc was born around 1412 to a peasant family in Domremy, a village in northeast France. At the time of her birth, France found itself engulfed in a devastating conflict with England. Later known as the 100 Years' War, Joan's life, like most peasants, would not have been easy growing up, but she rarely complained, always committed to her duties. She spent her youth spinning wool and helping out around the house. She also got her hands dirty, working with her father in the fields and tending to the family's livestock. However, she had one more responsibility that would prove crucial to her later rise. Joan received her religious education from her mother, Isabel. Isabel was a strict woman, but she piously ensured her daughter's religious knowledge was of a high standard, which would later help Joan's case with the royal family. Joan's area, though small and relatively insignificant, could not escape the ongoing conflict. In 1425, her village came under attack from the followers of a local rogue soldier who was taking advantage of the chaotic conditions created by the conflict. It was a significant event, however, because it preceded Joan's first vision. Joan, who was around 13 at this time, claims to have had a religious vision shortly after the raid. According to her account, Saint Michael appeared to her while she toiled in her father's garden, joined by angels. Michael told her to be good and go to church often, and she cried after they left, as if she had wanted to go with them. Well, did she know this would not be the last time she saw them? Joan began to receive apparent communications from other spirits too, namely Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, two saints who were well known in the area. She claimed that they would check in on her and make sure that she was fasting for Lent. When later asked how she knew the women were Margaret and Catherine, Joan stated that Saint Michael told her to expect visits from them. She may have seen them as kindred spirits. Though theologians at the time believed Joan's visions had a supernatural source, modern historians have suggested differing causes. Most of these theories cite neurological or psychiatric causes, including delusional disorder, hallucinations caused by epilepsy, schizophrenia, or creative psychopathy influenced by childhood trauma. However, there may have been another, more local motivating factor for her visions. Marie Rabine of Avignon was a French mystic who came before Joan's time. Rabine claimed to have had visions too, and many of her resulting prophecies circulated throughout the French countryside. One particular vision promised an armed virgin would arise from obscurity to save France from the English scourge. Joan may have cast herself in that role, and she earned a reputation for it. Joan became well known in the area for her outspoken recounting of her visions, and her claim to be the maiden savior of France. Charles II, Duke of Lorraine, caught wind of Joan's story while suffering through a sickness. Believing she may have had supernatural curing powers, the Duke summoned her to court. But Joan had some choice words for him. Charles II was well known in the region for his recent abandonment of his wife in favor of his mistress, who he was now living with. Upon their meeting, Joan did not mince words. After informing the Duke that she did not possess healing powers, she reprimanded his extramarital affair. Perhaps it was her growing reputation that stopped her from facing harsher consequences. Now, several years after her first vision, Joan had become a well-known figure locally, and she did not hesitate to advocate for herself. She let anyone who would listen know that her motivations arose from divine guidance from angels and saints alike, to lead France to victory against England and save the country. Such bold claims certainly got her the attention she wanted. All this time, Joan had openly sought a meeting with the king to convince him to allow her to pursue her ordained destiny. The military situation was growing increasingly dire for the French, and perhaps because of this, King Charles VII finally agreed to a meeting with her in 1429. Joan knew she needed to make a statement. The crown agreed to send a royal escort of 6 officers for Joan's journey to meet the king. Before leaving, they offered her clothing befitting a lady. But Joan ever, the individual, said she would prefer to travel dressed in men's clothing, a fashion choice she would become widely known for. But it was not just her clothes that made an impression. Joan finally met King Charles VII around February or March 1429, when she was just 17 years old. She boldly proclaimed that she would raise the siege of Orléans, but that wasn't all. She also promised to lead the king to France for his coronation, which because of the conflict had not ceremoniously occurred yet. After another private meeting between the two, Charles found himself convinced, citing Joan's devotion and purity as inspiration for the trust he placed in her. But there was one more test, just to be sure. Needing a little more assurance, Charles had Joan seen by a council of theologians. Though they found her to be a good person and a good Catholic, they still cast some doubt on her divine inspiration. Nonetheless, they concluded it would be a good idea to send her to Orléans to put that divinity to the test. A group of women also checked and confirmed that she was indeed a virgin. With that, the crown kitted her out. Bolstered by these tests, the crown commissioned a set of plate armor for Joan. They also gave her a sword and permitted her to fashion her own banner. After she took up the moniker Joan the Maiden, the stage was set for Joan's showdown with destiny. The crown sent Joan to Orléans as part of a relief army. The king's forces, known as the Armagnac, had been under prolonged siege in the city. Though they were holding out relatively well, morale among the men was at an all-time low due to how long the conflict had already been going. The arrival of a mysterious young maiden changed everything. Joan's arrival was like a warm wind, lifting the spirits of the downtrodden men. They found themselves re-energized by the promise of divine assistance in the conflict. Though Joan was not given any formal power, her presence among the front ranks rapidly gained her favor among the men. Armagnac commanders would sometimes even accept her strategic recommendations. It was a pioneering dynamic. Joan's respect within the armed forces and ability to influence battle tactics marked a trailblazing moment for women in France. She turned traditional gender roles on their heads. Never before did a woman have such huge responsibility at the top level, let alone one so young. Even her dressing in men's clothing was unheard of at the time, and the respect Joan commanded led to results. On May 4, 1429, the Armagnac switched into attack mode, having been merely holding their position up until this point. Joan played a major role here once again, hoisting a banner high and heading toward the battle. Her appearance had a huge impact on the soldiers, especially since she arrived in the face of a failed mission. Spurred on by the young maiden, they didn't give up and regrouped, going on the offensive once more and capturing the fortress. The shift in the tide of battle proved decisive. On May 8th, just days after Joan arrived at Orléans, the English army retreated after the French took their main stronghold. Having been at a stalemate for almost 7 months, the shift in the balance of forces marked an astounding moment for Joan's newfound influence and proved a turning point in the 100 Years' War. She sealed her reputation. Many sought the lifting of the siege to be a sign that Joan was indeed, as she had been claiming, sent by God. Many important clergymen and theologians found themselves inspired to publicly support her following her unbelievable successes, but Joan had unfinished business with the English. Following the good fortune at Orléans, Joan eagerly wanted to keep the momentum going. She firmly pressed the Armagnac command to continue the push forward through a series of battles. That would become known as the Loire Campaign. The operation would eventually result in a final victory for France, but Joan did not merely watch from the sidelines. Amazingly, Joan, despite her small stature and inexperience, enthusiastically participated in the thick of battle. She displayed a feisty toughness and used her apparent limitations to her advantage. On one occasion, she scrambled up a ladder against a fortified wall and had her helmet split open by a thrown rock. Joan, unfazed, continued the fighting, determined to see her royal champion get his due. On July 17, 1429, King Charles VII finally got his crown at an illustrious coronation ceremony. Joan received a place of honor by his side, a monumental achievement for someone who started their life as a seemingly insignificant peasant girl. Exclaiming that God's will had been satisfied, Joan set her sights on France's next campaign. After failed negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy over the peaceful transfer of power in Paris to the Armagnacs, Joan convinced the commanders to launch an assault on the city on September 8th. The attack did not go well. Joan herself received a wound in the leg from a crossbow bolt, and the Armagnac forces suffered major losses. But Joan insisted the attack go on. However, King Charles ultimately ordered the fighting to stop, resulting in defeat for the Armagnacs. Joan's position grew more tenuous. After defeat in Paris, the initial wave of enthusiasm for Joan began to wane. Her aggressive independence and insistence on fighting to the bitter end began to clash with the more ubiquitous advocacy for a diplomatic solution within the court. Many even saw her failure to take Paris as evidence against her divine inspiration. Nevertheless, her newfound position continued to solidify. After the failed Paris campaign, the king negotiated a truce with the Duke of Burgundy. As part of the treaty, the Duke had permission to reclaim towns previously captured by the Armagnacs, now acceded to him. One such town was Compiègne, which resisted the Duke's attempts at reclamation. Inspired by this, Joan organized her own mission in March 1490, with a group of volunteers to help defend the town, without permission from the court. It would prove disastrous for the young maiden. Joan's march toward Compiègne was initially successful, as China forces beat back Burgundian resistance. However, arriving at their destination with a dwindled force on May 23rd, the force's attack on Compiègne was unsuccessful. Joan was captured by the Burgundians, though she would not exactly be a gracious guest. Taken immediately into custody, her captors quickly moved Joan to a castle near Noyes, where she made one failed escape attempt. After that, the Burgundians moved her to a more fortified structure, Beaurevoir Castle, but it made no difference to the scrappy young girl. Joan made another daring escape attempt, this time leaping from a tower window into an empty moat. This resulted in an injury, and unfortunately, she failed to escape her captors. But it was enough for the Burgundians to know they needed to get rid of this headache. The English, having witnessed Joan's outside skill firsthand, were delighted that she no longer posed a threat. However, they wanted to ensure they wouldn't have to deal with her ever again. Negotiating with the Burgundian allies, the English agreed to pay her ransom, and Joan found herself ushered into their custody. Her fate now sealed. With Joan of Arc under their watch, the English knew they had to finish her once and for all. They decided to take an ecclesiastic route, and on January 9, 1431, Joan stood trial for heresy in Rouen. The charges were numerous and shocking. The English held nothing back when it came to charging Joan. She faced accusations of blasphemy simply because she wore men's clothes. They also charged her with acting upon demonic visions and of refusing to submit to the church. It was clearly a politically motivated endeavor, but more egregious than the accusations was the trial itself. The trial of Joan of Arc is one of the most heavily documented events of the era. From these sources, we can see just how many inconsistencies the proceedings had. Though it purported to be neutral, most of the participants in the trial were pro-French, and the English paid off the presiding judge. Furthermore, the interrogation had already kicked off before Joan was read her charges. Going against custom, the interrogations were coercive. Joan was not provided with legal counsel, and there is even evidence that trial records were falsified. Finally, on May 23rd, the court formally charged Joan with heresy. Her ultimate fate was unforgettable. Joan was sentenced to be burned alive on May 30th, 1431, but before her hands got tied up, she had a devastating request. She wanted to look at a cross throughout her execution. An English officer obliged, fashioning her one out of a stick. Joan pressed her lips to the sad symbol and lay it by her chest, but that wasn't all. Joan was also presented with a professional crucifix, which she held close to her prior to getting properly restrained. This was the cross she stared at as she passed away in the flames. What was left of her body wound up scattered to the same river, but though Joan would not live to see her name redeemed, her martyrdom would soon be honored. Though initially accused of heresy by the Catholic Church, the very same institution later honored her as an obedient daughter of the faith. Centuries later, her place in the canon would solidify. On March 2, 1922, Pope Pius XI declared Joan of Arc the patron saint of France. As is custom for canonized figures, she received a dedicated feast day, chosen to be May 30th, the day of her execution. Joan of Arc has become a revered figure in France, seen as the country's savior, honored as a martyr, and even became the national symbol of the country after the French Revolution, despite her association with the Church and the secular nature of that movement. Her influence, however, has spread far beyond France. On top of her reputation as a global icon of independence and liberation, Joan of Arc is notable for her reputation as a feminist. From her insistence on defying gender roles to her leading positions in areas previously only reserved for men, this unassuming young maiden has become a powerful symbol of girl power all over the world. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factor Nate, for more incredible facts about everything.